Federal agencies operating throughout the world face a number of unique challenges assembling, integrating, and using data securely to make decisions in real time. They depend on a wide assortment of communications platforms. They must process and assemble massive amounts of data. And in the case of the US Navy, they can't always upload data in real time. I'm Wyatt Cash with Scoop News Group, and here to discuss what those challenges mean and some of the emerging technologies helping them to overcome some of those challenges are three senior-level data and technology experts, beginning with Tom Sasala, Chief Data Officer for the U.S. Department of Navy, Mitch Skiles, Principal Architect, U.S. Government at Palantir, and Chris Ritter, Principal Systems Engineer at Dell Technologies. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the program. Well, let's start by discussing what are some of the primary challenges that federal agencies are facing, and the U.S. Navy in particular, when it comes to assembling and operationalizing data when they operate across the globe. Tom, let's get started with you.
Sure thing. So we obviously have a large number of issues and challenges that we need to get after. And some of them I will characterize as fundamental, and some of them are more, I would say, emerging issues because of some of the new emerging technologies. So in terms of the fundamental issues, we really do have some areas around just inventorying and cataloging our data, knowing what we have today, knowing what type of data is coming off of what sensors. And then because of that, once we start assembling these data and putting the data together, in some cases, we have some sensitivity issues about aggregation of classification of the data and things like this. And then, with the newer technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning, there's open questions about a trained algorithm. Is that a new data set or not? Should we treat it separately? Is it classified separately than the data and things like this? And when we're operating in a remote or a disconnected environment, then, obviously that's something where we need to worry about how do we actually get the data to where it needs to be to process it. So a lot of issues, a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunity there.
Mitch, let me throw that a little wider to you. What additional perspectives do you see in the way of global challenges pulling together data for agencies that operate globally?
Yeah, so from my perspective, it's not so much about necessarily the data itself as it is about how that data is augmenting and accelerating the decision-making process. So really the core challenge is, how do we promote the development and delivery of data products, these operational applications and data-enriched environments to end users and systems throughout and across organizational boundaries. And in particular, I often think about really two distinct areas of focus. First are all the technical challenges that Tom highlighted. Certainly the DoD has a particularly unique set of distinct challenges in the fact that they have to operate across a pretty massive distributed environment. We're not just talking about one cloud environment. We have many cloud environments, but also defense managed on-premise facilities, commercially managed facilities. We have disconnected tactical environments that come up and offline. And of course, the challenges of classification that lead to us operating across all of these distinct and oftentimes air-gapped networks and enclaves. But there's a second challenge here that I think is really important, and it's about data governance. Oftentimes, large organizations actually are challenged with building the appropriate amount of trust to share information across those boundaries. And so for me, the core questions that we have to ask from the technology side and what types of technologies we're building is, who has sovereignty over the data? Who's responsible for establishing the appropriate data protection and privacy policies? Who's the subject matter expert on the use of that information? And if we can crack that, then we can build trust in folks that the systems aren't going to, take advantage of their information and share it with the wrong folks. And then we can start to overcome some of those cultural challenges.
Well, in addition to some of the structural issues, I'm interested to hear, how are those challenges impacting the ability of agencies to move forward in making timely and in some cases real-time decisions? Tom, can you talk a little about that?
Sure, absolutely. So, I think Mitch had a lot of things that are on our list of items that we're actually getting after. And so the governance issue and I don't want to say data ownership issue, but really the issue of appropriate use of the data based on context is one of the things that we're trying to challenge with right now. And so, we're doing some basic fundamental things where we're trying to just catalog the information, but annotate at the data set level rather than the data system level. And what that allows us to do is say this data set was gathered by this information for this purpose in this context. If you're going to use it outside of that context, then let's go ahead and view the data maybe a little bit differently. And the use and terms and conditions on how you are allowed to bring it in, manipulate it, maybe export it or send it to someone else could change depending on the context of the mission that you're working on. And so we see this a lot in the logistics environment and the sustainment environment, where log data could be used from a how much money are we spending question, right? It could be used from what do we need to buy next question. But there's also a question about if you get too much logistics data, it might provide some insight into maybe where you're positioning assets or where you might be doing operations or the type of operations you're engaging in. So there's some sensitivity levels there that we need to kind of look into, and technology there can both sort of augment that possibility, right? But also what we're seeing is through this mosaic effect is of all of the information that maybe we don't provide, it might be provided by someone else, and people were able to reconstitute data sets that maybe we didn't want reconstituted. So that's just something to keep in mind, and some of the kind of broader challenges we're facing. So.
And Mitch, do you have some additional perspectives as you look across a broader range of federal agencies?
Yeah, so over the past couple of years, what we're really starting to see is that some of the massive challenges that our government faces are not only requiring data sharing inside of that organization, but it's about cross-agency collaboration and then coordination among public and private entities. And I think the COVID vaccine distribution program in particular is a striking example of this. So in terms of allocating and distributing vaccines in the United States, that required rapid coordination and data sharing among certainly HHS, CDC, Department of Defense, and the White House. But we also can't forget that there are research facilities involved, local hospital networks, the vaccine manufacturers, commercial distribution networks, pharmacies. I mean, the logistics problem that Tom's describing in the Navy sort of spans all of the federal government and is a large portion of how the federal government is currently operating with the larger commercial base. From our perspective, it's about supporting that network, supporting the information sharing, but then in the context of the COVID problem, you have this additional challenge of we have to provide equal service in the protection of health information, similar to the Defense Department's challenges around protecting sensitive classified national security information. And that's despite the urgency of these logistics challenges. So from our perspective, data management and actually operationalizing that data is at the heart of getting after some of these large challenges.
Well, Chris, I'd like to bring you into the conversation here. How and when will modern and emerging technologies likely help agencies reduce some of these challenges that we've been talking about around connectivity and data integration?
Well, when, let's take that one first. You can do it now, right? How is really more of an understanding of the needs of an agency. 5G is really the backbone to facilitate a lot of these interactions between distance or individuals or applications, right? But 5G is not a standalone technology. It's really part of an overall modernization effort, and it touches edge cases and IoT specifically, or cloud access, and it should really be looked at and based on a zero trust security principle and a framework that's designed to work together with other technologies. There was a couple of comments earlier about trust. If you think about how pieces of information or people are communicating to each other, and we look at it the same way, right? It's a framework of multiple things in terms of data trust or user access or authentication or application access. And 5G is really just a mode to get us there, right? So there's a lot of I'd say a large percentage of the agencies that we've talked with, specifically about 5G, have identified similar challenges in implementing a 5G cloud native model. Microservice clouds, vendor lock-in, and the economics of it are the general consensus of what the barriers are. But 5G by design is virtualized and an open in nature. And so from our point of view, what we've done is built a platform that can fully deploy a 5G stack end to end with automation, right? So let's take some of the economics and start to reduce them from a touch point of view. We have a validated telecom partner ecosystem that can operate on that platform. And then we provide the guidance and to identify the partners to achieve the actual outcomes that the agencies are looking for. So from a high level, I think adopting 5G is part of the overall strategy to facilitate and support the data fabrics and the distributed nature of data. It's going to be similar for most individuals or most organizations. I think really what happens is that's the difference that needs to be understood by each agency is the individual outcome that they're looking for, right? Because that will really determine the aggregate group of technologies that's appropriate for their particular use case.
And Mitch, what else are you seeing in the way of how emerging technologies helping address some of these challenges?
Yeah, so I certainly agree with what Chris's perspective is as far as some of the strides that we're making sort of on the infrastructure level. The reality is today that while we're modernizing aspects of our environments, there's other aspects that are not modernized. And we're also moving into a world where it's going to be multiple cloud providers that sort of dominate the infrastructure level. There's going to be multiple different technologies that are used in terms of serving those forward networks in the defense context, whether that's 5G capabilities like Chris is describing, or advancements in satellite communications that are, bring communications out to the battlefield. And so from our perspective, we want to make sure that we're able to deliver data capabilities despite the environments in which we're operating. We want to take advantage of those capabilities as best as possible and as they modernize, but interoperability is kind of the key, where we need to operate across a heterogeneous IT environment. So that's one perspective. And then the second piece that I think sets our approach apart from what I'm seeing in a lot of other companies that are sort of working in data software is that we need to focus on delivering mission-centric capabilities that seamlessly promote the use of data to the end user or system. So where other companies might be focusing on building tools and capabilities for data engineers and data scientists, at the end of the day, new technology is only as valuable as it is integrated with the people who are actually driving the organization forward, whether that's the folks down on an assembly line or the soldiers out in the battlefield, of course, sailors in Tom's case.
Well, Tom, we always hear a lot about the promise of emerging technologies. Bring us back to the real world. What are you seeing on the near-term horizon that gives you hope for tackling some of these challenges?
Yeah, so when I talk about new technologies and really its application, I like to break the problem down into the different layers. Maybe traditional IT stack layer example is not so dissimilar to where we are today. So we talked a little bit about 5G, and that really is that core transport layer, right? And so, one of the problems that the DoD faces, and Mitch mentioned interoperability, there's interoperability challenges throughout the entire stack, right? And so people in many cases, maybe might want to misplace their energy a little bit saying, well, we need data interoperability. Well, that's great, except, for us in the DoD, in many cases, we can't even get the bits to flow, whether that's between the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, right? Or whether that's between us and DHS or us and the FBI or whatever, or our international partners, right? And so there's a fundamental transport issue where things like 5G might help address some of those issues with getting everyone on a network that is a little bit more carrier agnostic, right? The next layer up, you do kind of have that data mesh problem, right? which is getting, once the bits start to flow, does that resilience and survivability of the transport infrastructure support what you're trying to do? And then the next layer up, at least from my perspective, is really where we're focusing a lot of our time in the CDO's office, right? Which really is that master data entity interoperability level problem. So when I send you a person object, for example, you understand what we mean by person, and the fields, the attributes of that person element are known and they're semantically interoperable with each other, right? And whether we call it first name or FN or something like this is really quite immaterial, as long as we know semantically what that attribute means and what that element means. And then once we achieve those levels of interoperability, they're all required and they all build on each other, right? Then we can get the more application level interoperability, and that's where the machine learning, artificial intelligence interoperability will start coming into play, right? Where battle management aids and decision aids and computer assisted decision making from a military warfighting perspective, as well from a business operations perspective on our side, right, becomes important, right? And then we achieve some higher level of interoperability from an intellect perspective. And so I don't say any one technology will solve the problem, certainly, right? So it's that integration that Mitch and Chris both talked about, right? They got to be integrated both horizontally as well as vertically, right, to pull all this together. And then you also have to realize, right, and you are in a very heterogeneous environment in modern IT. You don't have that luxury of being that kind of pure play anymore. The DoD 20 or 30 years ago was the #1 consumer of IT. It just didn't exist anywhere else. So we could set the standard and we could drive that interoperability by the fact that we are the #1 consumer. We don't have that luxury anymore. And I would say really none of the large companies or organizations actually have the luxury to set a standard and have everyone just simply adopt it, right? So it's a lot more collaborative in that regard. And so, I always say standards are a double-edged sword, right? And it's kind of where we are right now. And so a lot of different places we can inject, and certainly, everything that's been mentioned so far, all things that we're working on in different pieces. The challenge that we're facing right now, at least the senior leadership of the Department of the Navy, is really how do we stitch all those together to provide that mission outcome that Mitch mentioned, right? And how do we answer the questions that commanders are asking and influencing the outcome that commanders need to be influenced in a positive way. And then my concern here is how do we test that we did influence the outcome, right? And determine whether or not that outcome was a positive or negative outcome, right? And then how do we change our course of action further down the stream to get that outcome we're looking for? So,
well, when we think about the challenge of integrating data and making things more interoperable, we're hearing a lot more about data fabrics becoming increasingly important. Mitch, do us a favor and could define what data fabrics really is today, and why is it becoming increasingly important?
Yeah, I find it a little notable that we've moved away from these, water metaphors for data systems, data lakes, streams, pipelines, and now we're moving on to textiles with fabrics and meshes and stitching together. To me, the data fabric or data mesh concept, it's a reaction, I think, to the overemphasis on data collection, aggregation, and storage that's core to the data lake or data warehousing solutions of the past. And from my point of view, this data fabric concept is really trying to get after a data architecture that spans environments, cloud environments, on-prem, all the way out at the edge, and an information sharing model accompanying it. That seeks to empower distributed users and systems with the data or data products wherever and whenever they need them. And we can do this with software systems that focus on reducing complexity by centralizing, or at least standardizing and automating how enterprise information is governed and shared. I think Tom made a good point that it's, that's just one portion of the stack. It also requires the partnership of organizations like the Navy and the leadership that they're providing, as far as, okay, what are the decisions we're making about how to actually integrate and execute that automation with appropriate understanding of the interoperability between systems, whether that's through explicit data standards or policies that encourage this type of sharing across environments. To me, the key insight with data fabrics or data meshes is really recognizing that we shouldn't just treat data as the exhaust of old systems to be collected and analyzed, but rather information is continuously used, produced, enriched, for operational use and applications across the distributed nature of these large organizations and agencies. And so we need to design our systems. That's infrastructure that Dell's providing, that's software capabilities, that's the design of how organizations work and the roles in them that account for this reality of where information is produced and used.
Well, Tom, let me get your reaction to Mitch's description here of how data is sort of morphing into new ways of working. How are data fabrics manifesting themselves as you look at your strategic vision going forward?
Yeah, I like that analogy that we're moving into the textile area away from maybe water or whatever. It's interesting. So our view of a data fabric really is that centralized, and again, I use the word survivable and resilient infrastructure that allows us to send information around, right? Layered on top of that, and again, my perspective is a data mesh that provides a little bit more of that semantic interoperability at that data entity level. And then we can start working on the application. So completely agree with the kind of concepts and the foundations there. There still are challenges for us. I try to avoid some of the buzzword bingo and just say, oh, just deploy a data fabric or a data mesh. It's, the architecture itself that both the fabric and the mesh propose are fundamental changes in the way that we approach IT, systems development, acquisition, contracting, and a variety of other things in the DoD, right? So it's beyond a cultural change. It is a tectonic switch in how we want to acquire, build, design, and operate solutions. And so the days of one big system out there that can get adequately secured and have an authority to operate, and we apply our cybersecurity to it, and we create these central access points so we can watch the bits flow in the wire. Maybe those days are numbered in some regard, right? And I think that they are, right? Because if you want to move into more of a global fabric, right, where we can interchange and exchange information at various levels of interoperability, then how do you sense, how do you probe, how do you instrument a fabric to know that maybe you're the only one using the fabric or not, right? And so there's a lot of complications here in that technology, and it's definitely the way to go from our perspective. Certainly, if you want to consider just the benefits from security and the benefits from the increased bandwidth and the benefits from the survivability of the new modern technologies you get over what we have today. But not forgetting that we still need some backups, right? So the DoD is fond of this thing called a PACE or a PACE plan, right? Which is our primary alternate contingency and emergency plans, right? And so if your primary data mesh is not working, what is your alternate, right? If that doesn't work, what is your contingency plan? What is your emergency backup plan, right? And so we need to gracefully degrade over time when you're operating in a contested environment that with a peer adversary or near peer adversary, right? And so a lot of these solutions that the internet is built on and the internet age companies are built on are simply not survivable because they're not operating in a contested environment. They might be contested in terms of a competition, right? But you don't see companies actively trying to subvert or divert, the fundamental core of the internet, the cloud, the cloud and whatnot, against other companies. But you'll see that in some sort of conflict, whether it's armed or unarmed in our case, right? So that non-kinetic sort of portion of warfighting that is emerging is kind of the larger of the threats right now. And so you saw this, you're seeing it actually in Ukraine right now, but you saw a lot of run up of it. And some of the other activities were happening in that kind of European bloc in some of the previous conflicts we had as well. And so those are great learning opportunities for us. And thinking of, if the internet were literally to go down, like people could not transact, what would happen to the US economy, right? Step back and look at really broadly, right? And so we rely so much on the networking and the exchange of information right now today, just to do basic things that 10 years ago, even 10 years ago, we didn't do, right? Like I don't even think my bank has an actual physical location anymore, right? And just things like that. And like, I wouldn't get paid, right? I wouldn't be able to spend money, right? Because I don't have any cash, right? So it's that kind of like, let's step back and say, like, how do we really gracefully degrade using some of these modern technologies, and then have these companies like Dell and other companies, how does your solution support this kind of broader threat environment? So
Well, that leads to my next question for the three of you is, put yourself in the end user's shoes for a moment. How do you envision these emerging technologies helping agencies really move forward to operationalize their data to support employees working around the world and the public more effectively? Tom, let me throw it to you, and then love to hear from Chris and Mitch.
Sure, absolutely. So I think the number one benefit here from our constituency, whether that's a direct warfighter or whether that's the sort of generating force that supports the warfighter as well as the general populace of the United States, right, is really just accessibility and availability, right? It seems relatively mundane to say it that way, but what I'm trying to say is our services that we provide will be more accessible and more available to more people in a more timely manner because of these new modern technologies, right? And so hopefully we will get more efficient and more effective at providing them as well, which will either increase our time or decrease our time to market, or decrease the total cost of operations, which is code for saving taxpayers money, right? And then being able to maybe reinvest that in things that we're not doing today. So there's a lot of primary, secondary, and tertiary sort of benefits from these technologies, far more than I can possibly kind of run through right now. So I'm really interested in what Mitch and Chris have to say about this.
Yeah, Mitch, what are your thoughts there?
So, so I certainly agree with Tom's perspective on this one and where we're seeing this go as far as sort of improving resilience and accessibility. We just need to be mindful of avoiding one trap. We shouldn't require an epidemiologist to become a data scientist or an infantry officer to become a data engineer. These individuals have much more exquisite skills that they're bringing to bear. So I think there's another element here around data literacy and education that's important, certainly. But the types of technologies that we're talking about should make those researchers better researchers, should make commanders more effective, accurate, and timely in their C2. And ultimately, and Tom made an allusion to this earlier, we should be evaluating the role and success of technology against that, not against these folks sort of falling into computer science skills and data engineering skills. It's are they more effective at doing the job that only they can do?
Great point. And Chris, additionally, from your perspective as a big technology provider globally, what else would you add?
Well, I would absolutely agree with both perspectives there, right? From our point of view, and sticking with our fabric and textile theme here, it is a plaid. That is our perspective, right? Because you look at one thing as a data fabric as an enablement, right? Because you want to be able to span different clouds. You want to be able to span physical technology, right? If you think from a core to an edge, the connectivity types are going to be different, or the physical execution machine is going to be different. And therefore, maybe protocols and other methodologies from a device trust or user trust have to be thought through. But the benefit of how we see the data fabric is really about being able to apply security and rules and contextual components as an entity, right? So as those things morph and change, the entity doesn't break down. Right. So if you have in the point of a degradation scenario, you can apply the same rules and effects to something that is N-1, perhaps, right? In order to support the longevity and the viability of your fabric, right? And that's how we start looking at it in terms of 5G working as a data in conjunction with the data fabric, right? Because if you think of time, and it's mostly true now too, where if you think of the history and how people work today, right? Most organizations still would work and learn and apply knowledge in silos and execute one transaction at a time, or one activity, or one data point at a time. And it creates, a history of poor institutional knowledge or knowledge retention and dissemination. One of the examples you might see is as a group over time making the same mistake over and over again, right? Because they can't apply the knowledge that they've learned. And having data fabrics helps us integrate data for better decision making. It helps people work as a group and apply the knowledge that they have, right? So I think that distance or geography or data type or where it's created becomes less of an issue than it is overcoming the entity challenge, right? So that's how we look at it, because being fully software defined and creating new services and applications that can drive different architectural, technical, and operational models, as Tom mentioned earlier, is if you think of the stack, right? We're starting from the bottom and building that stack to where we can facilitate what the outcome is going to be without changing these things. As mentioned a minute ago, the warfighter doesn't have to become a data scientist, right? We're helping at each level facilitate the need, whether it's the adherence to the executive order within the physical and virtual infrastructure that works and supports all of these mechanisms, or it's supporting the pipeline of a particular piece of data to an outcome. It's the interconnectivity, if you think of the off time of the warfighter on a base. All of these things, and as a vendor, right, as we follow the model as a vendor, it helps us help the community achieve those faster, right? Because we take on those particular challenges and those models internally as well. And so what we learn from our own security aspects or our own processes that we put in place to provide a secure supply chain, that's our DNA. We've been doing this since Dell was started in 1984. And so we have real world experience that we can also contribute to the larger community, whether it's individual groups that are providing security standards or fundamental standards that people use from the application level or data sharing perspective, or just as a consultative scenario for people to take and build their own unique outcomes from our particular learnings in the past and what we do internally.
Well, just to wrap up now, love to hear briefly from each of you. And thinking of the CIOs in our audience, how do you see some of these solutions helping to boost the ability of agencies to, meet certain federal initiatives like the Federal Data Strategy and the White House Executive Order on Cybersecurity? Tom, briefly, your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, I think what we need to be careful of is, and we say this all the time, we're building the plane in flight, right? So how can we apply the new technologies that are at our disposal in a do no harm mechanism, right? So that we're not interrupting our ability to do our jobs on a daily basis, but simultaneously trying to bring in that infusion of technology, that infusion of any innovation. And in this case, I really like Mitch's point earlier, because innovation doesn't have to mean a new tool, right? Innovation could be a process optimization, it could be a training optimization, it could be just a simple organizational change, right? And how we structure ourselves and we communicate with each other. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here. I would say again, to the CIOs and now with the emergence of the CDOs and the partnership that we're doing there. In many cases at the federal government level, it's kind of split whether CDOs are in the CIO office or not in the CIO office. Public sector wide, it's more often than not that the CDOs are not actually direct reports to the CIO these days, right? But how do we partner on these things? And one of the things that I'm working on right now personally is taking some of the new advanced technologies that we have from an analytical perspective, integrating that data and providing information to the CIO so he can make better investment decisions, right? And so that's a burden that he no longer needs to take on himself, right? Of integrating all this data and trying to figure it all out. So we do have professional data scientists who that is their job, that is what they do, right? And so we're not trying to take that infrastructure specialist or that senior master sergeant or whatever and turn them into the data science professional, right? We're using their expertise as subject matter experts to guide our data scientists into the influencing those outcomes from the strategic vision provided by the CIO and the other executives, right? And so I would say step back and look at technology much more holistically. Step back and look at, I would say, any form of innovation more holistically. And I would, just avoid saying this tool is going to fix this problem and more focus on is how can I apply some new technique, some new innovation to influence an outcome in a positive way, right? And the tools and the technology will come along with that, in my mind.
And Mitch, your thoughts on how these technologies can help meet federal mandates?
Yeah, so on cybersecurity, I think so often what we see in the federal government is that cybersecurity is a headwind for innovation. And this is where I think the president's executive order is spot on insofar as it identifies that, yes, we're dealing with real and legitimate cyber threats, but it doesn't lean away from the use of these kinds of data systems and instead embraces the need to exploit and share information as a mechanism to protect our national security interests. And everything that the three of us talked about today is in pursuit of this. I think the government should continue to lean into these public-private partnerships. And quite frankly, the government can do more to push the defense industrial base to support their mission to defend and deflect and stay ahead of these threats and challenges that are forthcoming.
And Chris, your last thoughts?
Yeah, I think I would certainly echo both of the statements that were made. That specifically something that Tom said a minute ago is that the view of a framework or a view of the technology is second, right? The technology will come to support all the different outcomes that we need to have, but it's really about the perspective that we have as a vendor to the consumer, the providers to the consumer. And so we looked at the executive order really in that fashion and said, in order to be the best provider that we can to the consumer is how do they attack each individual area, so to speak, right? So we look at it as a pillar, a set of pillars, right? So we're grouping together devices and individuals and applications and things like that to develop trust, but within them, there are several different technologies and methodologies that you can apply to achieve success within that pillar, right? And so, you wouldn't just go out and apply an identity management access and technology just to be 100% compliance, because you're not going to get home with that, right? That's one of many things that needs to be applied in a linear step-by-step fashion, and you'll see success quickly from a consumer perspective when those things happen, right? So we take that plus our point of view in terms of being able to provide the things that we have to from a compliance perspective, like software bill of materials, right? Or the other compliance pieces that are stated within the NIST standards that define the executive order. But really our focus is in that pillar format to be able to report and govern and remediate and provide an additional cornucopia, so to speak, a basket full of technologies for people to consume that meet their specific needs. And that's another challenge, right? Is that some of the things that are simple, right? If you think, I'll give you a very simple example in our 15G server technologies and 16G server technologies that are coming. It's a simple mechanism in the actual boot process that we can provide, that if you turn a knob here can really mitigate a lot of challenges within the physical compute environment, right? And so applying little things like that, and over time as we grow that group of technologies, it's much, much easier to consume when you are looking at it as a framework, right? Because you're going to change operationally the standards that you have in place, the operational components that you do from a day to care and feeding for your entire environment, whether it's within your core, it's at the edge, and how you go about securing those things will be the same. It's just the knobs that you turn over time.
Well, Tom Sasala, Mitch Skiles, and Chris Ritter, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a lot of your insights on the just advances of emerging technology and how they're helping to operationalize and better secure data for federal agencies. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.